We are sitting here at the Religious Action Center. Fittingly, we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, and next year we'll be celebrating the Voting Rights Act. I think many of you know the history of this building, that in the conference room that before we developed this room we're in, down here in the floor above us, the historic conference room, was where the civil rights community, of course the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was housed here for 30 years, where the civil rights community drafted their pieces of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It's historic moments have happened in that room. The first Seder of the Dalai Lama that he had ever been to, and a lot of strategizing about issues. We're not in that room because this is a large enough group that we wouldn't fit in that room. And we're glad to have you down here, and it speaks to the robustness of this cause. This has been a time of enormous transition on this issue. Such great despair and tragedy, and then afterwards, which happens so often, determination, whether from an individual loss or from a mass loss of innocent lives, determination to turn things around, to make sure it doesn't happen again, in a sense of this nation that we would not be this time the prisoners of a bitter past here, but the shapers of a better future. We really believe that. And then with a legislative stalemate that has marked so much of political life in America, the inability to get even the most basic, sensible changes through the Congress here, but working together powerfully during that period of time, that whole run-up, in shaping that legislation, in advocating for that legislation, in getting it as close as we did get it here, due to the efforts of this group in making sure that throughout this nation, in mosques, in churches, in synagogues, in temples, wherever the gathering of people of conscience happened, this issue was on the agenda, liturgy about this issue, programs about this issue, and it happened because of you. You're here in the room and you on the phone. Here, the extraordinary efforts of Face United, of PICO, of other groups here, here, the cathedral that's played such an extraordinary role in this cause, Dean, and we're pleased and honored to have you here. This has been an extraordinary accomplishment. I know for us at the RAC, so much of what we've done has been part and parcel with everything that you've done, from the remarkable, memorable press conference on the grounds of the cathedral afterwards, which helped galvanize the conscience of the country. Here, the role that many of us played at the White House, engaging with the Vice President and the task force in shaping how they were going to approach this issue. Here, it was rare that we went in twice for key meetings about that. They were genuinely interested in engaging, recognized the need to have the faith community involved. Here, the effort here in cooperation or after some advice with the mayor's campaign to set up Faith's Calling using technology that they guided us to here, and engendering over 20,000 calls on those two crucial days with the vote when it was introduced, the background check bill, and then again right before the vote. Here to pick up, even if it wasn't on the front page of the New York Times, but some of the press coverage, the talks, religious community trumps NRA in terms of the calls that generated, and have such wall-to-wall support, not just from the groups who one would expect to be involved, but even if they didn't do it through this system, but at the same time to have groups like the Southern Baptist Convention, T.D. Jakes, and some of the megachurch leaders participating really for the first time engaging like this was a major breakthrough for us in broadening the religious community's agenda on these issues. And congregations across the country doing programming and educating people, working with families whose lives have been affected by this, here trying to do violence prevention and gun violence prevention in the work that they're doing, working with local schools, working with the broader community. This was an extraordinary array, and the fact that we've not accomplished what we want shouldn't allow us to lose sight with the enormous impact that the work that generated out of those of you here has had here. For us, a very dramatic and memorable moment, inspiring moment. At our biennial convention, 5,000 Reformed Jewish leaders from all over the United States, a personal victim of gun violence, Mindy Finkelstein, a survivor of gun violence, an ardent activist with the Brady campaign, spoke in the middle of our service, our major worship service, about her experience and the religious and practical lessons that she had learned. Nobody who was in that room will ever forget that moment. It bonded us as a movement and reinvigorated our determination. Every one of you can tell stories like that, either small or large, or as a result of how you've gone about doing this work. And like so many of you, we've have worked, Vinny, with you in terms of the gun violence prevention Sabbath weekend programs. We sent out community guides to every one of our synagogues to mobilize the community. I know many of the other groups here have done similar kinds of things here. This is an extraordinary achievement of what we have done so far. So I'm enormously proud to have you here in the building, in this gathering, in this historic building. I hope that what this building represents about achievements for social betterment and transforming America for the better will inspire all of us to be involved. And we welcome you all, and let me now turn it over to Rachel Lassen.
So here we are, mostly the faith community, safeguarders of our children's safety and our nation's moral conscience, and we're restless for change. Ever since 2 Aprils ago, when we lost the background check bill vote, we had a majority, but we weren't able to overcome the filibuster. We've all been searching for what our next steps could be, and we've taken those next steps. There's been sort of a multiplicity of approaches that have stemmed from the failed background check bill that include advocacy in federal Congress, still hoping for a background check bill, trying to keep guns out of the hands of perpetrators of domestic violence. We've had divestment campaigns, unload your 401k. We've had campaigns for cultural change, campaigns to keep guns away from some of our largest businesses and stores in the nation. We've fought for ballot initiatives on the state level and state bills. But Vinny and I, this meeting actually stemmed from Vinny and I talking a few months ago and him saying, you know, there are certain approaches that have data and a track record of being effective in preventing gun violence in this country and preventing gun deaths and gun victims. And us saying, we need to share that information. We need to make sure that the faith community is knowledgeable and can add this tactic to whatever else they're doing, right? Because we don't need to just pursue one approach anymore. We can pursue many approaches, and we think that pursuing fingerprint licensing in our states is a critical approach. The reform movement's also going to be pursuing, and I just want to mention this, a gun purchasing power approach, where we're going to local gun purchasers of the state, like police chiefs and mayors, and asking them to put pressure on gun manufacturers to create personalized guns and to monitor where distributors are selling our guns. That's another approach. But this approach that you're going to hear more about today from Professor Webster, that we're so excited to all gather and learn more about, is one that we know works. And so we thought it was too important not to share. So that's all I want to say. Now I want to turn over the floor to Dean Gary Hall, who's going to continue the conversation.
Sorry. I was talking to my neighbor. I left my notes someplace. Oh, here they are. Well, I'm Gary Hall. I'm the Dean of Washington National Cathedral. I'm also privileged to be the chair of this organization, which basically means standing behind Vinny and cheering him on. But it's a great privilege to work with Vinny and to work with all of you. 74 school shootings since Newtown. I don't know how we can live with that. I mean, we seem to be able to live with almost anything in our culture, yet when the numbers come at us in terms of the number of people every year killed by gun violence, the number of children killed by gun violence, not only in schools, but on our street corners around the country, it's hard for me to understand how we can live with this as people of faith, as American citizens. And for us people of faith, this is not a morally ambiguous issue, as Serene Jones, the president of Union Seminary, says. All of our traditions are very clear about not only the unacceptability of violence of human beings against each other, but all of our traditions are really clear about God's compassion and therefore the necessity of our compassion for all victims of suffering. And so I'm really gratified that many other faith traditions are now coming on board and speaking out and opposing gun violence. But we all need to remember that our mainline traditions, both in Judaism and Christianity, have been for years speaking out against gun violence. And so what we're doing, I think, is deeply in the main line of our traditions and deeply faithful to our scriptures and to our deepest understandings of what God calls us to live into in our lives, both as citizens and as people of faith. We are, though, I must say, even though we have had a disappointing, as Rachel said, we've had a disappointing period of time at the federal level, we are growing our impact as an organization around the country. We've had, last year when we had 2 years ago, we had our first March Gun Violence Prevention Sabbath. We had 420 houses of faith, houses of worship. Last year, a year later, we had over 1,000 faith communities, and we're determined to increase that number even next year. And so we're pleased that the website, marchsabbath.org, is the place you can go to for equipment, for resources, for help, for ideas, for liturgies and curricula, to get support for your oath community. And please know, let other people in your colleagues in faith community leadership know about that research. marchsabbath.org. This is a long haul thing. It's obvious that the last 2 years have been intense. We've been on a roller coaster. We've had successes, we've had setbacks, we've had great achievements and great disappointments. This is a long haul event, and the demographics are with us. The demographics of American culture are with us. Younger people are not interested in guns the way their parents and grandparents are. The majority of the people in the United States favor the long-haul strategies that we favor for reducing gun violence, and there will be a census in 2020, and there will be redistricting across the nation, and there will be opportunities for us to address the federal issues and to continue to work at the state level. But it's a long-haul thing, and we're just not going to give up until we see it through. Please put 2 events on your calendar. December 11th, which will be our second national vigil for victims of gun violence, and we will host that in conjunction again with the Newtown Foundation. And then March 19th, it's always around St. Patrick's Day, March 19th, our 3rd annual March Sabbath launch event. So thanks to David and Rachel and the Religious Action Center for hosting us today. I wish we had facilities like this at the cathedral. And thanks to Vinny for his work. And I now turn it over, I guess, to Vinny.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, those on the phone and those watching. The Religious Action Center and the Washington National Cathedral have done more than almost any other institution in the country to prevent gun violence. And I want a big hand for Rabbi Saperstein, Rachel, and Dean Hall. Thank you all for putting this together. Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence is a coalition of over 50 national faith groups, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Buddhist, from all across the country, united to prevent gun violence. Right now, we are going to hear 2 things. First, we are going to hear why we need to act. We're going to hear why we're going to need to act, and next we're going to hear what works. Why we need to act and what works. First, I'm going to introduce 2 of my dearest friends, Dick and Barbie Willis. Dick and Barbie lost a son to gun violence over 20 years ago. And they came to me when I was coordinating effort in Maryland and said, we want to help. Maryland has made a lot of progress since then in reducing gun violence. No one has done more than Dick and Barbie. Many lives have been saved in Maryland because of Dick and Barbie, and I'm honored that they're here with us. Dick and Barbie Willis, please come up.
We're sort of on the agenda as gun violence survivors. And let me tell you, if this is what survival is, I don't want to do it again. But our son was not a survivor of gun violence. 21 years ago, he was 21 then, so it's been 20. He's been gone for as long as he was on this earth. But he was sitting at a coffee shop with a couple of his friends when a young man entered the shop, and after some conversation about borrowing Charlie's pen, the young man pulled out a semi-automatic pistol and killed our Charlie. After spending a few days trying to absorb this event, the newspapers called it a senseless killing, as if there's any one of them that makes sense. Barbie and I contacted Vinnie DeMarco of Marylanders Against Handgun Abuse and asked what we could do to reduce violence. So became over a decade-long joist. Looking back over these years, a story told by Philip Yancey comes to mind, and it goes as follows. Stephen Chalk, a British friend, preaches eloquently about the need to stir up the church to change the world. Often he creates a make-believe image of a raging fire and a group of firemen lying nearby sound asleep. A young man comes with a bucket of water and he looks at the raging inferno and then at the sleeping firemen. He can do one of two things. He can throw the water in his bucket onto the flames, but that won't accomplish very much. And even if he keeps running back to the faucet to fill up the bucket again, he could not put out the fire. On the other hand, he could take that bucket of water and throw it on the firemen, waking them up so that they could join him in the task of putting out the flames. It's obviously that the second course of action is the better one. I don't want to seem arrogant, we don't want to seem arrogant, suggesting that we were the only ones carrying the bucket, for they were many, and Barbie made me cross out this next one, even some who seemed to have gasoline instead of water. I don't want to name any names on that. But a lot of firemen awoke and provided tools to fight the fire, and we're going to hear about some more of those tools that really make a difference in just a minute if I ever shut up. Whenever Barbie and I think about Charlie, we shed a tear. And we're not embarrassed about that, or those tears. What's embarrassing to us is the lack of tears from everyone when they hear of another of these senseless killings and don't shed a tear. Can't they see the flames? Are they sleeping? I know that you here today have already awoken or are waiting to be given the tools to put in your buckets so the fire can be extinguished and no more tears need to be shed. And I'm going to shush and let Barbie say something if she'd like.
Oh dear. I really didn't. I was sure I wouldn't cry. I was positive I wouldn't cry, but I am sorry.
Thank you very much.
Dick and Barbie's story is about as powerful a statement as you can get. Why we need to keep working. And next we're going to hear that we can do something about this problem. that there are tools that work to reduce gun violence. So I'm proud now to introduce Professor Daniel Webster from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, who is going to tell us that there are ways we can make sure there are no more Charlie Willises. Dick and Barbie have been leading this struggle in Maryland, have been doing so much, and they are inspiring us to do everything we can. But that doesn't mean anything if there's nothing we could do. And there are people out there who say there's no way to prevent this kind of gun violence. That is not true. There are effective tools, and we're going to hear now from one of the world's top experts on gun violence prevention, Professor Daniel Webster from the Center for Gun Policy Research at Hopkins, who's going to tell us that we can do something to prevent gun violence. Professor?
It's such an honor to be here at the Religious Action Center, and I thank you, Vinny, for giving me the opportunity to talk to this group. I'm probably asked in my line of work, goodness, it seems like once a week, how do you keep working on this issue? You know, Brian probably gets the same questions. You know, we're never going to get anywhere on this. How can you keep working on gun policy in the United States? And more importantly, how are we ever going to make progress? What I commonly say, actually, is the faith leaders have us. We're going to get to where we're going to go because of the faith leaders. I hope research can and will inform and help you. But frankly, I think it will be people like who's in this room today, who are in your congregations, who will make the difference. You need that deep passion that the Willises bring to this issue, that Vinny brings to it, and all of you bring to it to make change. There's no single one way that is foolproof to reduce gun violence. Thankfully, there are a number of approaches. In the realm of gun policy, in terms of what is politically doable, and we've found to be very effective, is what I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about today. Uses slightly different terminology, permit to purchase licensing, fingerprint licensing. I'll sort of walk you through this as we go forward. Is this going to, excuse me just a minute. There we go. All right. So if you want to purchase a firearm in the United States, obviously what that experience looks like varies tremendously, whether you're in New York City, Richmond, Virginia, Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's a varied experience, and there are different ways you can go. You can go to a gun store. This is a gun shop owner who, interestingly, lost his license eventually to sell firearms after a very bad record. His gun shop contributed hundreds every single year of guns that were used in crime, mostly in the Baltimore area. So you have gun shops you can go to. You can go to gun shows where this gentleman here, is selling a number of different types of firearms. He's got his little homemade sign. And this is cash and carry, no questions asked. You got the money, you're going to walk away with maybe an assault weapon, a semi-automatic pistol, whatever you need. You can go to the internet, use sites like Arms List, and find yourself someone who wants to sell a firearm, and then meet that person, some agreed upon place to do the transaction. Finally, another option, and this is the key of what we're going to talk about today, is your first step is you have to actually go to law enforcement. And while theoretically law enforcement, they should be involved in a background check system if you're going to purchase from the licensed dealer, this is who you're going through. Okay, this is a person who is making sure that this is a legal transaction, that you have the proper ID, that this is not a straw seller and all this sorts of thing. It's in his hands, the gentleman who stands to profit from this transaction. Contrast that with a law enforcement public safety official whose job is not to see how many guns he can sell, but his job is to keep the public safety safe. So here the process looks very different. It's a very rigorous process. They'll vet it very carefully. Often it involves fingerprinting, which verifies the person's identity. And it turns out all this matters, and that's why I'm going to share some data with you today about that. And we've also provided a little sheet here too, a few pages, gives some background information. I hope you'll take a look at that. And there's a lot more specifics in there. So why might this be helpful? Well, first of all, ensuring the purchaser's identity. Years ago, the General Accounting Office did a study where they sent people, they had them make fake IDs and sent them into gun shops in, I believe, about 6 different states, where the system was not a permit system. It was, you go directly to the gun store. Dozens of people went through those gun shops with their fake IDs, buying a great deal of number of firearms. There wasn't a single time that anyone questioned anything about their ID or anything about those purchases. It led the General Accounting Office at that time to conclude that our current federal system for screening firearm purchases is deeply flawed. And I would agree with that. I suspect very strongly that this would be a deterrent to straw purchases. If I'm a convicted felon and I'm going to try to convince Gary to purchase a firearm for me, it would probably be a lot harder to convince him to do that if I said, okay, first we're going to go down to the local police station and they're going to fingerprint you and do a careful background check, as opposed to, I'm going to take you to my favorite gun shop where they never hassle us, we're in and out, and we'll get our guns and you'll get your money. Very different experience, I suspect, in those 2 different scenarios of Gary's willingness to help out his good buddy.
You got that
Right.
right.
And then importantly, bring this to the national discussion just for a moment. This, in my personal opinion, is the best mechanism by which to do universal background checks. If I'm trying to sell a firearm, in this type of system, one scenario, all I have to do is someone shows me that they have been vetted, they have the license, I know that that's an okay sale. That person has been vetted. The current other alternatives that are being proposed, maybe for very good political reasons, requires that I go down to the gun shop and do that transaction. I personally think that, I just sort of suspect that this is going to be a system where you get better compliance, is my hunch. I could be wrong. All right, so we've done a couple of studies where we looked at the relationship between state firearm sales policies and what I'll call indicators of diversions of guns to criminals. These are situations where the gun trace that the ATF does from guns recovered by police officers indicate a very short interval between a retail transaction and involvement in crime from someone other than the legal purchaser, okay? So what we found is that permit to purchase handgun licensing, and there are different varieties of this that look very different. In essence, the most stringent form that actually gives law enforcement some degree of discretion, even if you don't meet a technical disqualifier, if there's something in your background, maybe you have several arrests for domestic violence but no convictions, for example, the local police could say, no, I'm not going to issue that permit on grounds we think that that's a too risky transaction. And then, so we found that among all the different firearm sales policies, the strongest relationship between less diversion was permit to purchase licensing that required either in-person or some sort of fingerprinting type of verification for the purchaser, okay? I won't go into that anymore. There are other policies we also found to be protective. We can talk about that, including simply regulating all private transactions, like universal background check idea. Okay, so we had some data indicating that it seems to do what fundamentally, when we think about the objectives of gun control, which is keeping guns out of the wrong hands, right? So that's what these prior studies indicated. But we still didn't know for sure whether preventing more guns in that underground gun market was actually going to translate into lives saved, which is the bottom line Vinny keeps reminding me. So we could decrease that supply, but there's still enough guns floating around there. That's what opponents will want you to believe, that this is a hopeless cause because criminals are always going to be able to get guns through theft or other means. So that's why we looked at this in a very systematic way. Most of those states that have these policies have had them in place for many, many decades, and therefore it'd be going back 50 years or more to try to look at changes. There's really was only 2 policy changes in recent times that we have decided to study. One was in Missouri. Missouri had this policy in place since 1921, but effective August 28, 2007, the lawmakers in that state repealed their permit to purchase licensing laws for handguns. Previously, if you wanted to purchase a handgun, you had to go to the local sheriff who would vet that whether you were a legal purchaser and could purchase handguns or not. So that was the way that they did universal background checks, and they got rid of that system. So we contrasted what happened in Missouri, their changes in homicide trends with other states. We looked to see if any of those changes we saw were specific to the target of the policy, which is guns. We looked to see if this intermediate outcome of diversion was a clear mechanism, whether some states, their homicide data are dominated by 1 or 2 cities. So would you actually see increases in many different locations, or would it be localized? If you saw it statewide, gave you more confidence it's the policy change that's driving it. And then, as any researcher, we're trying to rule out other factors that might explain that. So I'll walk you through what we found very quickly here. The yellow line here is the trend for gun homicide rates in Missouri. Oh, excuse me, this is overall murder rates in Missouri. And what you'll see here is a clear departure from the trends in the United States that coincide right when this policy is changing. You see homicide, murder rates going up in Missouri while they're going down in the rest of the United States. Well, we thought maybe this is a regional phenomenon. So this graph here shows you the percent increase in firearm homicide rates for Missouri, again in yellow, contrasted with the United States overall, which is a little over 5% reduction and a 2.2% reduction for all the states that border Missouri. I learned a fun fact of U.S. geography of how many different states touch Missouri, and that's in this slide. So we looked at each of these other states to see how firearm homicide rates were changing, and again, it looks to me, and I assume to you, to anyone, you don't need a PhD in statistics or anything like that to know that Missouri stands out in terms of what happened there following their getting rid of this policy. So to look at whether this was a statewide phenomenon, again, we looked at things at the city and county level. What we found is that sort of across the board in metropolitan jurisdictions, there was at least a 25% increase in gun homicide rates across the board in Missouri. So it did not seem to be a localized phenomenon. I apologize, this is a busy slide, but I'll try to boil it down very briefly. this is part what I was referring to as this indicators of diversion. So guns moving very quickly from retail sale to involvement in crime. And what we found in breaking this data down from the ATF's trace data is that coincident with the policy change that starts to go in effect towards the end of 2007 and then more fully in 2008 is a twofold increase in the proportion of guns that had this indicator of diversion following the repeal of their permit to purchase policy. We also found, consistent with the theory, that the proportion of guns used in crime in Missouri went up dramatically of those that had originated from sales within the state. In the average state, about 70% of guns used in crime come from within that state. Missouri, before that was the case, it was around 55%. And then by the time it got rid of it, it's back to the national norm of around 70%. So again, all of this is consistent with more guns being diverted to criminals following the repeal of this policy. There's a lot of stuff on this slide now that I realize shouldn't be here because it's not right for this audience, but I wanted to be able to say heteroskedasticity. See, I thought I could say that and try to impress you, but it didn't work, so I'm sorry. So I'll simply say that we used very sophisticated statistical tools to make sure that we controlled for all the potential confounders that might explain some of these disparities that was going on in Missouri. And so we control for police per capita incarceration rates, a general indicator of crime levels being burglary rates, unemployment. This policy change did coincide with the economic downturn. So it's important for us to try to control for things like poverty and unemployment, as well as other policy changes that were going into effect in not only Missouri, but in other states as well. So we looked at several different outcomes. Overall, for the data through 2012 for murder rates, the repeal was associated with a 14% increase in murder rates over that time period. Over a shorter time period where we had data where it was easier to look at the weapon-specific effects, we found that firearm homicide rates, again, 25% increase associated with this policy change. As one would expect, there was absolutely no change in rates for non-firearm homicide in the state of Missouri. Their trends more or less mirrored the national trends exactly. So again, very briefly, we found that the policy change associated with a very large and statistically significant increase translates, again, Vinny always wants me to bring this back home to lives, translates into about 50 additional lives lost per year associated with the repeal of this policy, okay? So this is not small. This is a big effect. And again, we went through the checklist, immediately followed policy change, evident over a long period of time, specific to the firearm policy. The trends were unique of what's, we weren't seeing in other places. And importantly, the diversion data line up with the theory that homicides were increasing because it was so much easier to divert guns into the underground market, into the wrong hands, and lives were lost as the effect of that. Now, the other main policy change that occurred in somewhat recent times was in Connecticut, that they adopted this policy that was effective October 1st, 1995. So the prior data that I just told you, that's all been published. What I'm going to share with you now is a new study and some new findings that we have not published yet, but we're going to be writing up and submitting very, very soon. Again, it was a very similar policy. Here we get to see not the effect of taking it away, but actually implementing it. We used sort of a new technique because homicide trends can be very unique to particular states, and looking at all 50 states together isn't always helpful. So we used a new methodology that weights the data based upon which states seem to be the best at predicting what was going to happen in Connecticut. So this is the solid line is Connecticut's firearm homicide rates. This dotted line here is the set of controls, what we call a synthetic control group. That was this amalgam of the other states that were very similar to Connecticut's trends. And the other line up there was, all states that didn't adopt this policy. But for our purposes, our interest is in this synthetic control group versus Connecticut. And what we found is about 2 to 3 years after the policy was in place, you see a pretty big widening gap between the firearm homicide rates in Connecticut and those in the control states. It translates into depending on the year, 20 to 30% change, reduction associated with this policy. Interestingly, when we do the same exact approach with non-firearm homicide rates, we see absolutely no divergence in response to this firearm policy. So it wasn't some overall phenomenon in lethal violence that changed in response to the gun law. It was specific to the target of the policy. So just briefly in summary, we found very consistent effects here. In this study, we looked at 10 post-law years, which is about as comfortable. Going further, there's more assumptions, and we're not as comfortable assuming things beyond a 10-year spectrum. But basically, that translates into about 30 lives saved per year. Again, not a small number. It's also worth noting that other studies have found that this policy is also effective in reducing suicide rates as well. And if you don't know already, there are more firearm suicides in the United States than there are firearm homicides. So this is an effective tool to prevent premature death, both from homicide as well as suicides. The last point is basically one that I already mentioned, that I think this is relevant to the national conversation about background checks. It is, in my opinion, likely to be a more robust way to do universal background checks than current policies being discussed at the national level. But I think it's a very effective tool. If you'll notice, the states that currently have this policy, yes, some are the usual suspects of New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, now Maryland, thanks to hard work by Vinny and others. But notice that states like Iowa, Nebraska have this kind of policy, North Carolina. The idea, again, is not a controversial one. That we should have a system to keep guns out of the wrong hands is not controversial. Okay? Whether you own a gun, whether you love guns, you hate guns, nobody wants guns in the wrong hands. So the question in my mind really is, what's the most effective way to do that? And in my opinion, our most effective way to do that is through a permit to purchase licensing system that the good people in Iowa, Nebraska, and other places have not revolted and said, oh my God, this is violating my Second Amendment rights. I can't, you're taking away my guns and blah, blah, blah. No, this is simply a mechanism by which we have a more effective background check system. We don't rely solely upon the individuals profiting to vet that transaction and get that background check system working. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. Now you all know why Daniel is the guru of gun violence prevention around the world. We have a few minutes for questions, and I'm going to keep the mic on, please, sir. If you have a question?
Oh, I'm Ruth Flower with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. The initial thing is going to be how intrusive this is, but I realize you do not go to a car dealer and get them to certify that you know how to drive. that's taken by a state agency who takes your fingerprints, I think, picture definitely, and other things. This is just like, a gun is a little bit more dangerous than a car.
Yeah, thank you. It is very analogous to yes, the question was, isn't this analogous in essence to what we do with cars and licensing drivers? And that's an astute observation and right on the money. So that has been the rationale that many people have used when they talk about this policy, so people sort of get it and they sort of understand, like, oh yeah, we managed to have this process in place to keep people who shouldn't be behind the wheel, similar idea, keeping guns out of the hands of individuals who shouldn't have them.
Okay. You mentioned there are more deaths from suicides than from homicides. And I'm wondering the extent, is there any data as to whether the controls that you would put on purchase translate into the number of suicides as well as homicides?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that hasn't been completely unraveled, I'll admit. So what I suspect is the reason that we find some protective effects on suicides for this licensing system is not simply because felons, for example, are going to be more suicidal or something like that. Although many of the risk factors for interpersonal violence are also risk factors for harming yourself. Maybe top of the list would be substance abuse problems. Okay, so some people are screened out because of domestic violence, some substance abuse disqualifications, and they could be protective against it. But I think in addition to that, the relative how casual it can be to purchase a lethal weapon when you don't have a permitting system where you have to go to the local sheriff. There could be more impulse buys, is my guess, when someone loses a job, a young person, intimate relationship falls apart and they think it's the end of the world. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios where in a short-term moment, it seems as though there's nothing to live for, and so a quick and easy way to end it is a firearm. So a permitting process makes that a little more conscious system, my guess, I don't know, that's my hunch.
Margaret? Name, please.
Margaret Ayers. One of the things that the pro-gun side likes to use as a question to throw at our side and the people who support preventing gun violence is, if all these gun laws are working, then how do you explain Chicago? Could you talk to the people across the country as well as us about that one?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So, and of course, implied in that question or underlying that is that Chicago has very strict gun laws. We all know. Well, Chicago is not an island. Even though Illinois has slightly better laws than some other states, it's not the strongest laws in Illinois. And there are gun dealers, in essence, that ring the city boundaries that contribute a lot of the guns that go in and are used in gun violence in Chicago. I do think that people have the misunderstanding that Chicago is just one of our most violent cities. It's not. One of the reasons it has more homicides than most is that it has a lot more people. But on a per capita basis, it's nowhere near the top in terms of its homicide rates. And by and large, Chicago law enforcement have used their strong laws to their benefit so that there would be even more gun violence without the strict local laws. But even to sort of take that one step further, what is so evident when you look at the data from Chicago is that the criminals and traffickers are exploiting the weak laws that are in place federally as well as at state levels. A good number of the guns used by gang members in Chicago are sold by gun dealers in Indiana that has some of the weakest gun laws. So there are connections to gun violence and gun policy in Chicago, but I would say that if there's any failure in policy, it's the failure of federal gun policy and state gun policy that makes it too easy to dangerous people to get guns.
Patty Johnson from the National Cathedral. It's pretty clear, according to the data, that these laws work. So I'm confused why other states are not enacting them.
Well, thank you for that question. The recent data that I showed you on homicides is really brand new. Okay, so Vinny knows more about what's going on in our research because he calls me 6 times a day. So he was way ahead of the curve. He was way ahead of the curve and got this on the agenda for Maryland, and we enacted it in 2013. So one comment I wanted to make, following on some of the earlier introductory comments, is while there was no big federal win in 2013 following the Newtown tragedy, to our calculation, 44% of the American population is living in a state that strengthened its gun laws in 2013. And so, yes, you can point to bizarre policies in Montana or something like that that's making it even more ridiculous gun laws, but where most of the people live, in the most populous states, California, New York, other states like that, again, Illinois, 44% of the population is living in a place that had stronger gun laws now than was the case before Newtown. So that's something to never lose sight of, that there actually is progress.
Thank you. A couple more here.
Thanks for your presentation. I wanted to know, obviously Maryland and some other states that we're close to are pretty progressive when it comes to gun laws. How do groups in other states, what can they do to help, like in Montana or other places? Where do folks start in those states to make efforts to gain some ground on some of these problems?
So I want to say from the outset that I'm no expert in advocacy. I've been working on gun policy for almost 25 years. I pick up a little bit of stuff from Vinny and other people about advocacy and the politics of it. There are certain states, frankly, it's going to be really, really hard to do something like this, without a doubt. There's too much distrust of anything that has gun in it. There will be a knee-jerk reaction. And it's the gun lobby has been so effective over so many years of convincing people that regulating guns is the same thing as confiscating guns, or it's just a mechanism to do that. And it's very hard to do anything that seems completely reasonable when that is the mentality, that if they believe that it's going to lead to confiscation. So that's a big hurdle. But there are a number of places where you can look at the set of laws, and it seems as though they have a lot of other policies in place. They just haven't gone to the most effective one. So Pennsylvania, for example, comes to mind. For a state that has a pretty high level of gun ownership, they have a number of policies that we would say are good policies. They do have universal background checks and some other things. They might be susceptible potentially to considering such a system. I don't know, I'd have to sort of go down the list, but it's surprising. There are states that seem pretty red and seem pretty gun friendly that still have policies like, state licensing of gun dealers, for example, or background check requirements and things like that. So to me, I think it would be probably wise to think about places that currently regulate private transactions that might want to do it in a more robust way through the system. I mean, that was the case in Maryland, of course. And then others who seem close, was it Oregon that we came close recently? I'm trying to remember. Or was it Washington?
Oregon, Nevada,
Yeah. So some of these states that are considering universal background checks if they're open to, again, to this general concept, look, we need to keep guns out of the wrong hands. We don't have the tools to do that now. Our system is not foolproof. Let's have a right system. Maybe that's a place we can make some ground.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Hi, Leslie Watson Malachi. I am, actually, Vinny, this may be a question for you, but I want to thank you, Professor, for sharing both the public and the to-be-published data with us at this time. Very thought-provoking, very much so. But Vinny, I'm wondering for those who are watching, the pastors, ministry leaders, folks who are wanting to be involved in this work, who are concerned about what has been presented, what they see, what they know, what is it that can be shared with them to, especially for those who have a concern about their 501c3 status and doing political work? What can we share with them about that?
Reverend, thank you. If you don't mind, let me have one more question for Daniel, and then I will answer that. Thank you. Thank you. Final question for Professor Webster.
Hi, thanks for the very informative presentation, Dr. Webster. I'm Rhett Engelking from the Franciscan Action Network, and so I'm noticing the legislation we're talking about is handgun licensing, and I'm wondering if in the data, certainly handguns are more easily concealed and less likely to be used for hunting and other purposes. Are there distinctions made between, in the data in terms of firearm deaths and so forth, between handguns and maybe assault-style semi-automatics or, hunting rifles and so forth?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. The bulk of our gun violence is with handguns. Anyone who's worked on this issue will tell you that it is far easier politically to focus on handguns as a tool. It's hard to say that they are sports, for hunting or things like that. And generally, it's been a way to focus this on a crime issue as opposed to just guns, and not alienate sports shooters. While assault weapons are particularly dangerous style of weapon, thankfully they're not real prominent in most of the day-to-day violence that we see, whether it's in Baltimore and other communities as well. So I think simply regulating handguns in this manner has a huge public safety benefit. Of course, it seems prudent to me to do it across the board on firearms. This is sort of a similar concept, that you have a very lethal weapon. We shouldn't take lightly of who has those guns. And the laws are pretty clear on the books. They don't say that, for example, felons or domestic violence offenders may not have a handgun. They just say a firearm, right? And the tool that I'm talking about today with permit to purchase licensing is a mechanism to keep guns out of prohibited people's hands. So the logic would be that it should apply to all firearms, but it's often just that simply comes down to politics of, can you bring one more person onto a bill by saying, okay, we won't touch your shotguns or rifles, we're just going to go on for handguns. So.
Thank you very much. If everyone on the phone could please not talk, thank you. Thank you all very much for joining us here. Daniel told you that we can do this. We can reduce gun violence. The tools that he talked about are extremely effective, and they work. Sadly, Missouri tells us that if you repeal such a law, people will die. Connecticut tells us if you enact such a law, people will live. We know we can do it, and we know from Dick and Barbie that we have to do it. What I want to talk to you about for a minute is how we did it last year in Maryland. I want to start by playing a TV ad, which we ran after we enacted our Firearms Safety Act, which included the fingerprint licensing.
It is the latest deadly shootings across an open fire here.
Something had to be done. And here in Maryland, we stood up. and join the governor and the legislature to pass real solutions
that reduce gun violence by getting weapons out of the hands of criminals.
With a fingerprint licensing law that 68% of gun owners, like me, support.
A requirement that's reduced gun crimes in the 5 states where it's the law.
It will work for Maryland.
And it could work for the entire country.
Maryland, solutions that save lives.
I think in those 30 seconds you saw why we succeeded in Maryland. Because we brought together faith leaders, we brought together moms, we brought together even hunters. And we had another part of our coalition, the law enforcement community. In Maryland, police chiefs across the state came to Annapolis and said, we need fingerprint licensing of handgun purchasers because it works. But of the most important grassroots power to make this happen in Maryland was the faith community. And you all have a letter that went from the top faith leaders in Maryland to every legislator in the state, signed by Bishop Eugene Sutton, who headed the Ecumenical Leaders Group, and many other faith leaders demanding that they enact this legislation for the reasons that Daniel talked about. It worked. The faith leaders wrote this letter. They went to the rallies. They contacted their legislators. They contacted the governor and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, and they listened. And we got it done. What we want to talk about together as Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence is how faith leaders can do this all around the country. And one of the tools that we want to employ is to have the faith leaders in the states that have these effective tools, like Bishop Mark Beckwith from New Jersey, who's here with us, from Episcopal Bishops United to Prevent Gun Violence, contacting their colleagues in other states to say to them, you need to enact these policies also, for your sake and ours. One thing you heard from Daniel is that when states have these effective gun violence prevention tools, they will still have gun deaths, less, but the gun deaths will be because of guns coming from other states. New York City, which has had fingerprint licensing of handgun purchasers for decades, has much fewer gun deaths per capita than almost any other city. 90% of the handguns that kill people in New York City come from out of state. 90%. So imagine with me if the Episcopal bishops of New York City, the Methodists, Jewish leaders, Muslim, all of them wrote to their colleagues in Pennsylvania and every other state, your guns are killing our people here, as well as your own people. Please enact the fingerprint licensing of handgun purchasers like we have. And that's our vision for Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence. And those of you who are listening out there, watching this, we'd like you to think about this. And check out our website. Go to faithsagainstgunviolence.org. Go to marchsabbath.org, as Dean Hall suggested. Become part of what we're going to do next March, because at that Sabbath, we're going to be talking about these effective tools all across the country. At this point, I want to introduce our closing speaker, but first I want to thank very much the people who made this happen, Patty Johnson and Howie Levine, Craig Steppert, and Brian Birch, all of you who did so much. And again, Dean Hall, Rabbi Saperstein, and Rachel, thank you for your wonderful words. Professor Webster, of course, for your inspiration. Most of all, I want to thank Dick and Barbie Willis. They are why we are here. And Dick and Barbie, together, we're going to make sure that nobody else has to go through what you went through. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to ask Reverend Leslie Watson Malachi from the African American Ministers in Action to give us closing words and closing prayer.
Thank you all very much for this time. It has actually been very rewarding for me to be with you for just a few minutes, because that's all it's been, is just a few minutes, but it's been a few profound minutes that we've had together. And so the danger of giving me a microphone and asking me to close, Vinny, is I'm a Baptist preacher. And Baptist preachers, we always have points. And so, but what I want to do is to just share a few impressions about this time, and also just recognizing the value and the importance of the work that is being done, those things that we know about and those things that we don't know about. But the first thing I want to say is that this has been a time of inspiration for me, and I'm sure for others that are here. Not only because we get to hear about Charlie, some of you knew about Charlie before I did, but that he's introduced, but also it keeps Charlie before us at all times. And I want to say to you, Barbie, don't be embarrassed about tears. At no time, whenever they come, however they flow, let them flow, because that keeps him real and important to us who do this work, because it's not just about legislation, as it has been said. It is about the persons whose lives have been lost and those who have been left behind. And so for the memory, the inspiration is very important, the memory of those, of individuals like Charlie. The second thing is what I appreciate hearing about was the different kinds of ideas that are coming forth, how the work can get done. And again, the majority of clergy that I work with, they are the ones, Vinny, just like you were saying, that they're the ones that are that will participate in the Sabbaths because they know that it is something that would be doable for them. It connects with their faith tradition. It allows them to, again, be safe in their 501c3 community. But most importantly, it's another kind of way besides marching, besides signing petitions, besides sending a letter. It's another kind of more visible way that people can be involved. So the Sabbaths are really critical in all the different kinds of ways that we make that happen. You know, finding time during a worship service, even if it's just once a month, to say, did you hear this? Did you see that? What did you think about this? Or just provide some affirming words or comforting words for families and those and all those others. So the inspiration, the ideas that are coming forth, and most, hearing that it's not one size that fits all, and that was something that I really did come away from with the presentation. And everything that's going on. There, we've got to understand that even though we're talking about gun violence here, that it is multiplicity, it's multifaceted, and again, it means different things to different folks, whether it's about the assault weapons, whether it's the handgun, who gets it, how they get it, whether it's labeling the young person who just got pissed off one day and decided, who was just a young person that was pissed off the day before, and then the day afterwards, that person is a killer now. That person is a criminal. Or that woman who had been abused for so long and just got to the point where she said, I can't take it any longer. Those kinds of things, the one size fits all, how they come into our folks' hands and how they're utilized. And that speaks again to the intensity. And when I heard about PTP, it really is more about how do we make the data that you presented here very plain for folks to take and to utilize it? How do we take those examples from Missouri and from Connecticut? For me, I just preached in Minnesota, and I thought it was a joke when I approached the church, and the sign on the front door was a big sign, and it said, "Guns are not allowed in the church." And, and I kind of laughed, and I said, okay, so do I need to be concerned? I said, I'm all prayed up and everything, but, but it was a part, and it was in the church bulletin because of the laws that have been passed. And so a sacred place is not necessarily a safe place anymore. And so we've got to really look at how we take that data, how we take that information, and be more intentional in how we use it. And then we've got the impact on safety. It is a public safety benefit for faith communities to be involved in this. When you look at the data, the 2010 census said that there are 236, I believe it is, faith traditions, ways that people identify in this country. That's a lot of folks who we can connect with. Those are millions of people who, again, who are going to a place of worship at some point. For the African American community, Pew Research said that that the African Americans are in the place of worship once a week. We're talking about 79% of the population. That's a lot of people. That's some good time to get some good information and to do good. And then lastly, the image that we have as faith leaders when we go forward in this, we get to take the image of love. We get to take the image of peace. We do get to take the image of compassion. We're the ones that demonstrate forgiveness in a way that you don't see out there in any kind of other situations, especially as it relates to gun violence, no matter how the situation happens. It is about cultural competency in those images. So when you talk, Professor Webster, about working with the, I think it was you or maybe it was Vinny, about working with the law enforcement community. And again, looking at whether it's the young people, whether it's elders, whatever it may be, that is important to the image. We put the face, again, going back to Charlie. This is a young person. This is a person who had a future, whose parents had plans, who were looking forward, and et cetera. It's got to be a part of the work that we do. And so, I am really about responsibility, about accountability, and about building community. And the joy that I get from being a part of this work, and whether I get the emails or listen in on the conference call, is that we are building community. And we're building a community that, in my faith tradition, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 50, verse 20, it said, Joseph said, what man meant for harm or evil, God intends for good. And so those bad laws, we have an opportunity to change those laws. We have an opportunity and a responsibility to educate people and to commit people to being active, to being advocates, to stepping out, and to be courageous, again, for all of those whose lives have been lost, but most importantly, for all the lives that can be saved going forward. And so I thank you. I thank you so much for that. And so let me just quickly just close out here, Vinny, and in my tradition, Father, and then I give you praise, I give you honor and glory for this opportunity that we have had to come together. I give you praise and give you thanks for the time of sharing, for the time of feeling, for the sweet, sweet spirit that was in this place, for the unity that is going forward, stronger than it was before we walked into this door. I thank you for the breaking bread and for the organizers who put this together and who looked at the different ways to bring together the science and the data and to put it with our faith, with those who pray, with those who praise, with those who worship. And so as we move forward, for anyone who may not have gotten a sense of what it is that they are to do as a result of this time, then you speak to them in your own way and in their quiet time. But I know that many of us are now more committed, more determined to share what we have heard, to make sure that we are prepared for the dates and the times that we have been called upon to step up and to really be true representation of faith in action. And so I pray for strength, I pray for peace, I pray for the families, for love, and only kind of love that you can give, and for comfort, but strengthen their testimony and their witness. Let them not grow tired in sharing and telling. Let them not go, let Barbara and Dick, let them not go tired in letting people know about Charlie and all the other Charlies that are known and unknown, that they are the voice for the voiceless at this time. And so many will pray this prayer of thanksgiving in many names, whether it be in Muhammad, whether it be in the name of ancestors, in many, many names. But for me and my household, I pray it in the name of Jesus. And I give thanks for what was, what is, and what will be for Faith United to prevent gun violence. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend, very much. And we also want to thank you so much. I also want to thank every town for gun safety and the Brady campaign for your national leadership. I think we're ready to close the webcast. Thank you all very much. Okay.